Next up, we have Jordan Davis, the defensive tackle out of Georgia, who, is just a fun player to watch. Fun player to scout in general. Generally I like to start these videos talking about, if the player participated at the combine, some of their measurables. Well, we're talking about a guy in Davis who might have had the best combine performance of any defensive tackle ever. I think that's a fair statement. As grand a statement as that might be, it's a very real thing. He measured in 6'6", 341 pounds, had a 32-inch vertical, a 10-foot 3-inch broad, a 4.78 40, and if you didn't hear me, I'll say that again, a 4.78 40 yard dash by a guy that is 341 pounds, which is absurd. And I don't want to say that is why a lot of people like him as a prospect, because people have liked him for the last for the last year, 2 years, 3 years. Like, Jordan Davis has been a name that you've heard of. At one point, he was in the Heisman discussion, right? Like, he's a real, he was a real force and a real name on that Georgia defense. And that's why I was very excited to put the film on. In that regard, in terms of his film, did he live up to the greatest combine performance ever? Maybe not. But I think that there's a very high ceiling here that he could attain with some NFL coaching and some refinement in some of these areas that we're going to talk about. So I will say right away, though, with that being said, that might have sounded negative towards Davis. I have him as a first-round player, and he's my highest-graded defensive tackle. So in that regard, very high on him overall. But in terms of some of the positives, negatives, and we'll just go through my grade as we go. So anchor and strength at the point of attack, out of 20 points, I gave him a 17.75. Now, this one was interesting because looking at him and his weight and, just the strength by which he plays on occasion, you would think that this grade should be a 20 or a 19. And I went a little bit lower, and I think the reason for that was because of his height. He's kind of giving up leverage on just about every play, right? Like a couple of videos ago, I was talking about Tyler Linderbaum and how he's 6'2" at center and has a natural leverage on every defensive tackle he faces. Jordan Davis is one of those guys where, he would have to make up 4 inches of leverage, and he has to do it with his strength. But I think at times he could get moved a little bit more than you'd expect, right? Like, you just look at his intangibles and you'd think like, oh, this guy has never moved backwards and has never given up a yard of ground on the line of scrimmage. And then you put on the film and he's very good in that regard. He's my second highest graded player in terms of an ability to anchor in this draft class so far, but it's not quite on par with some of the guys we've had in previous years, by example, Like, just for example, I gave Tyler Shelvin last year, the defensive tackle out of LSU, an 18.5. I didn't quite think Jordan Davis was at that level where I'd necessarily want him as a pure nose. Maybe a one technique, sure, but a pure nose is an interesting discussion that we might revisit here as we continue. In terms of his explosiveness, I thought it was very good, but I thought his get-off was rather inconsistent. And, maybe that's just the snap anticipation, but the problem is that, the interior defensive linemen, they are the literal closest guys to the ball on the field, right? So they should technically be the first defenders to react. And it just didn't quite seem like he was at that level that maybe a 4.78 40 would suggest, right? Like, I didn't see that level of get-off. His 10-yard split was a 1.63. I wish I saw that more often. I'll just say that. I gave him an 11.25 out of 15, which some people might really disagree with, but I thought for me, that was where he fell. In terms of block shedding, oh man, I gave him a 9 out of 10. I would say arguably his best grade. Just his hand quickness and hand strength, obviously, was very, very impressive. It could just throw guys, if you wanted to. He's not a guy that you're going to make a living as an offensive coordinator single blocking, right? Like, just not at all. Not the type of guy that you want to leave your guard or center out on an island necessarily on a consistent basis. Very, very good. Just getting rid of guys and making a play. In terms of the motor, I thought it was, generally solid. I did have some questions about some potential fatigue, so I gave him a 7.5 out of 10. But it was interesting because, like, on some of the longer developing pass plays, or it's tough, right? Because what motor do you necessarily expect out of a nose tackle or a one technique? It's hard to say, right? Like, you don't necessarily expect those guys to be making plays out on the edges, but it's nice to see the effort. Sometimes I felt like that effort could wane, and I thought maybe that was a conditioning issue because it did feel like maybe later in games that became more of a problem, but at the same time, he was on a very limited snap count as is. And I should have grabbed the exact number, but you got to remember this Georgia front seven was very talented and deep, right? And in that regard, he was already getting decent rest times, right? So it's kind of tough to say like, oh, it's a conditioning issue, because then it becomes even more of a concern at the next level. But as is, when he's out there, he's generally like, I think he might be going as hard as he can, but I don't know if that necessarily is very hard, if that makes sense at times as games progress. Hopefully that makes sense. In terms of finishing and tackling, I thought he was very good. I gave him a 4 out of 5. Block recognition, I gave him a 3.5 out of 5. It just felt like sometimes he could maybe like get caught with his eyes in the backfield. I know that's an expression. I don't know if you guys have heard that, but like instead of reading what his keys are telling him in terms of, say, his visual key, which might be the center, or the pressure key, which might be a guard, instead he's basing his movements, it felt like at times, off of what's happening in the backfield. And sometimes what's happening in the backfield is meant to deceive you, and in that regard, I just thought he could do a better job sort of tuning that aspect of his game, right? If that makes sense. In terms of the leverage, I already talked about that. I give him a 2.5 out of 5. Is it his fault, per se? It's not his fault he was, 6'6", but he plays 6'6" at times. And I think that's where the issue comes in. And I think that's why sometimes that strength and ability to anchor isn't quite there, because he's letting guys get up under him, and the expression is low man wins. Well, Jordan Davis is very rarely the low man, so it did seem like he was losing a little bit more than he should have. And by losing, I mean, getting driven back a yard. And that's not bad for most guys. Like I said, I gave him good grades elsewhere, but for a guy of his size, I think you'd maybe expect more than you necessarily got. In terms of, with every evaluation I do, I like to have two kind of catch-all grades at the end, more so just based off raw, height, weight, your size in general, and then athleticism in terms of your combine performance and things of that nature. I gave him a 4.75 out of size, and I gave him a 5 out of 5 on athleticism, which is the first D tackle that I've done that with between this draft class and the last draft class. I don't know if I necessarily saw that combine athleticism manifest on the field always, but there were flashes of it, no question. And I think in that regard, he's the type of player that, will impact your team day one in terms of some of the flashes. And then hopefully as time goes on, you can help refine some of the process in terms of the block recognition and things of that nature, maybe the snap anticipation, things that I talked about earlier. So all in all, very good player, has a very high ceiling, right? Like, he's probably the best interior defensive lineman, and I'm categorizing him as a one technique. I know he played, a good bit of three technique snaps. I would rather see him between the guard and center personally, sort of in like a Vita Vea-like role where, they're running a 4-3 and you just put Vita in a gap and, let whoever tries to block him, right? That's what I want Jordan Davis to be, sort of that gap penetrator on the inside as a one tech, not a three tech, but a one tech. I think there he could definitely have some success. So if you thought this video was a success, you want to support the channel, leave a like, thumbs up, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that stuff, so that way you're in the loop with my future uploads. I know I've said it already, but I'm kind of spamming you guys here right before the draft, but hopefully you understand and appreciate the discussion. So with that being said, that's all I have for you guys today. I'm mic'd up. Now I'm mic'ing out. Peace, guys. See you next video.